In the 50s, cinema was more than entertainment. It was an event. Families dressed up well, bought tickets in advance, and entered giant rooms illuminated by bright signs. It was a golden age of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, Paramount Pictures, and Warner Brothers, when Hollywood dominated the world with epic films, unforgettable novels, and grandiose musicals. Television was beginning to enter homes, and cinema needed to reinvent itself. That's where the giant screens, the cinemascope, the increasingly impressive color films, and monumental productions like Ben-Hur and The Ten Commandments appeared. The stars seemed larger than life itself. Marilyn Monroe became a global symbol of glamour, while James Dean represented the rebellious youth of that generation. In the 60s, everything began to change. The world was undergoing cultural, political, and social transformations, and cinema reflected this directly on the screens. The films got bolder, deeper, and more experimental. It was the era of boundless creativity. While Hollywood was changing, Europe was also revolutionizing cinema. Directors created works that were more artistic, more human, and more realistic. And in the United States, productions like Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho showed that suspense could stir people's minds like never before. It was also in this decade that the Goldfinger phenomenon helped turn James Bond into one of the most famous characters in film history. The halls were packed, the audience buzzed, and cinema became more and more part of popular culture. Then came the 70s, and many people consider this the best decade in the history of cinema. Hollywood was freer, bolder, and full of new talent. Young directors began to create more intense, violent, exciting, and realistic films. The so-called New Hollywood emerged. It was a decade of gigantic classics like The Godfather, Rocky, Jaws, and Star Wars. Movies that weren't just successful, they changed cinema forever. Steven Spielberg created the Moderna blockbuster concept with Jaws. George Lucas turned science fiction into a worldwide phenomenon with Star Wars. People were standing in huge queues at cinemas. Children collected toys, posters, and magazines. Cinema now dominated pop culture as well. In the 80s, everything got bigger. More action, more special effects, more adventure, and more excitement. It was a decade of muscular heroes, unforgettable soundtracks, and films that marked entire generations. The audience wanted fun, escapism, and grandiose experiences. Films such as Back to the Future, E.T., The Extraterrestrial, Top Gun and Indiana Jones, and the Raiders of the Lost Ark dominated the box office. And you couldn't talk about the 80s without remembering the rental companies. Walking into a store full of VHS tapes was almost a ritual. People walked the halls looking for a movie to watch on the weekend. It was a completely different experience from today's streaming. Stars like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, and Tom Cruise have become global icons. Special effect began to evolve rapidly, paving the way for the future of cinema. Then came the 90s, a decade that mixed nostalgia, technology, and innovation like no other. Digital effects began to revolutionize Hollywood. When Jurassic Park hit theaters, audiences were impressed to see dinosaurs looking real for the first time. It felt like magic. Soon after came gigantic hits like Titanic, The Matrix, and Forrest Gump. Films that emotionally marked millions of people around the world. The 90s were also the era of the great video locators, the crowded cinema sessions in shopping malls, and a unique feeling of watching a release surrounded by hundreds of people reacting together. From the glamour of the 50s to the revolutionary effect of the 90s, cinema has changed the way the world dreams, imagines, and thrills. Each decade has left its mark. Each generation had its favorite films, its heroes, its unforgettable stories. And maybe that's exactly what makes cinema so special. Because even after so many years, some scenes, songs, and characters remain alive in the memory as if time had never passed. The most amazing thing is to realize how cinema has accompanied each generation. In the 50s, he represented elegance and fantasy. In the 60s, rebellion and transformation. In the 70s, innovation and creative freedom. In the 80s, adventure and gigantic entertainment. And in the 90s, excitement and technological revolution. But there is one thing that all these times had in common: experience. It did not matter whether the person lived in a big or small city. Going to the movies was special. The smell of popcorn, the huge posters on the walls, the sound of people talking before the movie started. It was all part of the magic. When the lights went out, it felt like the world outside disappeared for a few hours. And it was precisely this magic that created some of the strongest memories in popular culture. Anyone who lived through the 70s remembers the impact of watching Star Wars for the first time. No one had seen anything like it before. The space battles, the lightsabers, the special effects. It felt like the future before my eyes. In the 80s, children dreamed of time travel after watching Back to the Future. Young people wanted to fly planes because of Top Gun. And a lot of people cried watching the farewell in E.T., the extraterrestrial. Already in the 90s, cinema began to enter a new digital age. Computers began to create effects that were impossible to do in the old days. And when The Matrix showed slow motion scenes revolving around the characters, the audience was completely blown away. Cinema didn't just show stories, it showed the future. And while the films evolved, the actors also became world legends. Clint Eastwood has become a symbol of classic westerns. Robert De Niro marked the 70s and 80s with intense performances. Robin Williams touched entire generations with his charisma. And Leonardo DiCaprio became a worldwide phenomenon after Titanic. Directors also became real celebrities. Their name alone already made people want to watch a new movie. Steven Spielberg, Martin Scorsese, Stanley Kubrick, and Quentin Tarantino helped turn cinema into art and spectacle at the same time. And there was something else special about that time: waiting. Today, everything comes instantly via the internet. But in the old days, people waited months for a release. They watched trailers on television, collected film magazines, and discussed theories with friends. When a big movie came out, it felt like a world event. The lines went around the blocks. Some sessions sold out completely. And a lot of people watched the same movie several times in the cinema. Cinema was part of people's lives in a different way. He inspired fashion, music, toys, video games, and even the way people talk. Phrases from movies became part of popular culture. And perhaps that is why so many old films remain alive to this day. Because they weren't just movies. They marked moments in the lives of millions of people. First dates, family sessions, weekends with friends, entire childhoods built in front of a giant screen. Time passed. Technology has changed. Streaming has arrived. But the feeling of watching a great movie remains one of the most powerful experiences ever created. Because in the end, cinema has always been more than moving pictures. It was emotion. It was memory. It was imagination. And for many people, it was an unforgettable part of life itself. And even with all the changes in the modern world, there is something in classic cinema that remains impossible to replace. Maybe it's the feeling of the old images, the graininess of the tapes, the soft colors of films of the 50s, the striking soundtracks of the 70s and 80s, or that nostalgic feeling that makes a simple scene bring back memories of entire decades. Each era had its own identity. In the 50s, cinemas were real palaces. Huge curtains slowly opened before the movie began. The audience remained in absolute silence as projectors illuminated the giant screen. In the 60s, youth began to change Hollywood. The films became more moderna, bolder, and closer to reality. Cinema ceased to be just fantasy and began to reflect the conflicts and dreams of society. In the 70s, everything seemed more intense. The scripts got deeper, the characters more human, and the stories more exciting. It was a decade in which Hollywood risked more than ever. Films like Taxi Driver and Apocalypse now showed a darker, more psychological side of cinema. Meanwhile, Rocky made millions of people believe again in overcoming and impossible dreams. Then came the 80s, perhaps the funniest decade in cinema. It was impossible to walk into a rental store and not see giant covers of action, science fiction, and adventure films. VHS completely transformed the way people watch movies. For the first time, families could review their favorite movies indoors whenever they wanted, and that changed everything. Cinema came out of great halls and directly entered the living rooms of the whole world. It was also the era of unforgettable franchises. Rambo, First Blood Part 2, The Terminator, and Ghostbusters have become cultural phenomena. Kids wore t-shirts from movies. They collected dolls. They memorized entire lines. Cinema was everywhere. And in the 90s, technology began to push boundaries that seemed impossible just a few years before. Toy Story showed the world the first major fully computer-animated film. That seemed revolutionary. Soon after, Titanic became one of the greatest phenomena in history. People watched it several times in the cinema. The soundtrack played everywhere. The film became part of world culture. And then came the end of the decade with The Matrix, bringing special effects and concepts that would change moderna cinema forever. But beyond technology, what really marked these decades were emotions, fear and thrillers, laughter and comedies, tears and novels, the adrenaline rush of action movies, and the charm of adventures that made the audience forget about reality for a few hours. Cinema had the power to unite unknown people within the same room, all feeling exactly the same emotion at the same time. Today, a lot has changed. Movies are watched on mobile. Streams release new productions every week. The special effects were huge. But there's still something magical about old movies, because they carry the soul of their times. They're living portraits of decades that have passed, but that remain eternal in the memory of those who lived those moments. And maybe that's exactly why so many people keep going back to the classics. Not just to watch a movie, but to revisit a piece of the past.